The bitter feast. The stench hung heavy in the small, one-room hovel, a cloying miasma of damp earth, unwashed bodies, and the unmistakable, sickeningly sweet aroma of decay. Alara coughed, the sound a dry, rasping echo in the oppressive silence that had fallen over their meager meal. Across the rough-hewn wooden table, Thomas chewed slowly, his eyes fixed on some unseen point beyond the crumbling mud walls. His face, usually etched with a weary kindness, was now a mask of grim determination, tinged with a disturbing pallor. Beside him, young Maeve watched with wide, terrified eyes, her small hand clutching Alara's calloused fingers so tightly that her knuckles were white. On the cracked earthenware plate before Thomas lay the remnants of their grim sustenance. A half-eaten rat, its fur matted and greasy, its tiny teeth bared in a final, silent snarl. Two more of the creatures lay sprawled on the table's edge, their lifeless bodies stiff and cold. A skeletal fish, picked clean weeks ago and saved for whatever meager nutrients might still cling to its brittle frame, sat on another plate, untouched. Beside it, a hunk of bread, green with mold and hard as stone, mocked their hunger. Alara's stomach churned, a familiar knot of nausea tightening in her gut. She had managed a few mouthfuls of the stale bread, the taste like dust and despair in her mouth. Maeve had refused even that, her small face pale and pinched. But Thomas had eaten the rat. He had picked it up, its cold, stiff form a testament to their desperation, and devoured it with a grim resolve that both terrified and humbled Alara. Their village, nestled beside the whispering reeds of the fenlands, had once been a place of simple rhythms and quiet contentment. The land, though unforgiving, had provided enough. They had fished in the murky waters, gathered reeds for their roofs and baskets, and cultivated small patches of hardy grain in the drier patches of earth. Life had been a cycle of hard work and meager reward, but had been life nonetheless. Then had come the sickness, a creeping pestilence that had swept through the village like a scythe through ripe wheat. It had started with a fever, a burning heat that left its victims weak and delirious. Then came the coughing, a racking, bloody expulsion that stole breath and life in equal measure. One by one, their neighbors had succumbed, their bodies wrapped in simple shrouds and buried in the hastily dug graves at the edge of the marsh. The sickness had spared Alara, Thomas, and Maeve, but it had taken something else, their community. Those who remained were too few, too weak to tend the fields or fish the waters effectively. The meager stores of grain had dwindled, the fish grew scarce, and the familiar bounty of the land had turned into a cruel mockery of their hunger. Winter had followed the sickness, a relentless, biting cold that seeped into their bones and gnawed at their resolve. The fun froze, trapping what little life remained in its icy grip. The few animals they had kept, a scrawny pig, a handful of chickens, had long since been eaten. Now, even the rats, once a scurrying nuisance, were becoming harder to find, their numbers decimated by the harsh conditions and the desperate hunger of the survivors. Days blurred into a monotonous cycle of gnawing hunger and bone-deep cold. They huddled together for warmth, sharing their dwindling breaths in the frigid air. Alara told Maeve stories of sun-drenched summers and bountiful harvests, tales that seemed like distant dreams, almost fantastical in their current reality. Thomas, his usual optimism dimmed but not extinguished, would try to find small tasks to occupy them, mending their tattered clothes or reinforcing the crumbling walls of their hovel. But the hunger grew, a relentless, gnawing beast that clawed at their insides and clouded their minds. They tried everything. They boiled scraps of leather until they were a gelatinous mess, hoping to extract some sustenance from the tough fibers. They foraged in the frozen marsh for any stray roots or berries, their fingers numb with cold and their hopes dwindling with each fruitless search. They even tried to trap birds, setting crude snares with frayed bits of string, but the few birds that braved the winter winds were wary and elusive. Then had come the rats, driven by hunger as desperate as their own. The creatures had begun to venture into their hovel, their eyes gleaming in the dim light of their meager fire. At first, Alara had been repulsed, her stomach lurching at the sight of the vermin that usually scurried away from human presence. But as the days stretched into weeks and their bellies remained empty, a horrifying thought had begun to take root in her mind. She had voiced it one evening, her voice barely a whisper in the gloom. We could try to eat them." Thomas had looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and despair. "Alara, they're filthy. They carry disease. And we carry hunger," she had retorted, the desperation in her voice sharp. "Which is the greater threat now, Thomas?" Maeve had whimpered, burying her face in Alara's side. The thought of eating the creatures that scurried in the shadows was terrifying to the child. But the logic of Alara's words was undeniable. They were starving. Their bodies were wasting away. They had no other source of food. The first rat they caught had been small and scrawny. Thomas had killed it quickly with a heavy stone, his face grim. Alara had tried to cook it over their small fire, but the smell was sickening, the flesh tough and unappetizing. She had managed a few small bites, forcing them down despite the revulsion that rose in her throat. Maeve had refused outright, her eyes wide with disgust. Thomas had tried a little, his expression a mixture of distaste and grim acceptance. The next few rats had been equally unpalatable, offering little more than a fleeting sense of fullness followed by a lingering nausea. But they were sustenance of a sort. They kept the gnawing emptiness at bay, even if the thought of them made Alara's stomach churn. Today, however, had been different. They had managed to catch 2 larger rats in their makeshift traps. Thomas, his face gaunt and his eyes hollow with hunger, had taken one of them and, without even attempting to cook it properly, had begun to eat it raw. Alara had watched in horror, her own hunger momentarily forgotten in the face of his desperate act. The raw flesh, the tiny bones crunching between his teeth, the blood smearing his lips. It was a scene that would forever be etched into her memory. "Thomas," she had whispered, her voice trembling. He had stopped chewing, his eyes meeting hers. There was a wildness in them, a flicker of something akin to madness born of starvation. "We have to survive, Alara. We have to survive for Maeve." The bitter feast part too. He had continued to eat, his movements mechanical, his face devoid of emotion. Alara had turned away, tears stinging her eyes. The line between survival and savagery was blurring, and she feared what they might become in their desperation. Now, the silence in the hovel was broken only by the occasional sigh from Maeve and the soft sounds of Thomas's chewing. Alara looked at her daughter, her small face pale and drawn, and a wave of fierce protectiveness washed over her. She would do anything to keep Maeve alive, even if it meant facing her own revulsion and despair. She looked back at Thomas, his face now smeared with blood and grime. He was their protector, their provider, and the burden he carried was immense. To resort to eating raw vermin, it spoke volumes of the depth of their desperation. As the last of the rat disappeared down Thomas's throat, he let out a long, shuddering breath. He looked at Alara, his eyes regaining a sliver of their former clarity. It was not good," he said, his voice hoarse, "but it filled the emptiness." Alara nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. She knew it was more than just the emptiness that had been filled. Something else had been consumed in that desperate act, something precious and fragile within them. The day wore on, each hour a heavy weight of hunger and cold. Thomas laid down on their straw pallet, his body still and silent. Alara worried about him. The raw meat, what diseases could it carry? But she knew better than to voice her fears. He had done what he felt he had to do. As darkness fell, the wind howled outside, rattling the flimsy door of their hovel. Maeve snuggled closer to Alara, her small body trembling. Alara held her tight, whispering soft words of comfort, though her own heart was heavy with dread. Suddenly, there was a scratching sound at the door. Alara froze, her senses on high alert. They had had no visitors for months. Who would be out in this bitter night? The scratching came again, more insistent this time. Thomas stirred on the pallet, his eyes opening slowly. "Who is it?" Alara whispered, her voice barely audible. There was a muffled sound from the other side of the door, a weak, almost whimpering noise. Thomas pushed himself up, his movements stiff and slow. He reached for the heavy wooden bar that secured the door. "Stay behind me," he murmured to Alara and Maeve. With a grunt, he lifted the bar and slowly pulled the door open. A blast of icy wind swept into the hovel, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, something faintly familiar. Huddled on their doorstep, shivering and covered in a thin layer of snow, were two figures. One was small and frail, wrapped in tattered furs. The other was larger, its form obscured by a heavy cloak. As the larger figure raised its head, a gasp escaped Alara's lips. It was Agnes, the widow from the next farm over, a woman they had thought had perished during sickness. And clutched tightly in her arms was a small, whimpering lamb. "Agnes!" Alara cried, relief washing over her in a dizzying wave. Agnes's face was thin and pale, her eyes sunken, but a flicker of recognition lit them as she looked at Alara. "Alara, we need help." Her voice was weak and raspy. Thomas helped them inside, his weariness momentarily forgotten. Agnes sank onto the floor, cradling the lamb protectively. The small child wrapped in furs whimpered softly. "It's my grandson, Finn," Agnes explained, her voice trembling. "His parents, they both succumbed to the sickness. We have been wandering, searching for others." Alara quickly helped them settle by the fire, offering them the meager warmth of the dying embers. She looked at the lamb, her heart pounding in her chest. It was small, barely more than a few weeks old, but it was food, real food. But as she looked at Agnes's gaunt face and the frail form of the child, a sense of empathy washed over her. They were all survivors, clinging to life by a thread. Could she bring herself to take their only source of sustenance? Thomas, however, seemed to have no such qualms. His eyes were fixed on the lamb, a primal hunger gleaming in their depths. "We have nothing left, Agnes," he said, his voice rough. "We are starving." Agnes looked at him, her eyes filled with a desperate understanding. "I know," she whispered. "We are too. But he is just a lamb. He will not feed us for long. But he will feed us now," Thomas countered, his gaze unwavering. The tension in the small hovel was thick and heavy, the unspoken question hanging in the frigid air. Who was more deserving of survival? Their small family, who had endured the sickness and the bitter winter, or Agnes and her orphan grandson, who had also suffered unimaginable loss? Alara looked at Maeve, her daughter's eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope as she looked at the lamb. She looked at Thomas, his face etched with a desperate hunger. And she looked at Agnes, her face a mask of weary resignation. The answer, she knew, was not a simple one. There was no easy choice in this brutal reality they now inhabited. They were all victims of a cruel fate, forced to make impossible decisions in the face of unimaginable hardship. As the wind continued to howl outside, a new kind of storm brewed within the small hovel, a storm of desperation, empathy, and the agonizing weight of survival. The bitter feast they had just endured was a stark reminder of the depths to which they had sunk. The arrival of Agnes and Finn, with their fragile hope in the form of a small lamb, presented a new and equally agonizing dilemma. What would they do? What could they do? In this desolate landscape of loss and hunger, the lines of morality were blurred, and the fight for survival had become a desperate, all-consuming battle. The coming days would test the very limits of their humanity, forcing them to confront the true cost of survival in a world stripped bare of compassion and plenty. The story of the bitter feast was far from over. It was merely the prelude to an even more harrowing chapter in their struggle to live. The ashen shroud of clouds thickened across the southern horizon, their weight pressing down on the desolate plains. Gusts of wind, born from the rugged expanse, whipped up dust devils, unsettling our small caravan. Abraham, his face a canvas of weathered lines beneath a time-worn cowboy hat, clutched two Colt revolvers, his knuckles white. His gaze darted relentlessly, a hawk surveying its prey, while his wide eyes and gaping mouth betrayed the raw fear clawing at him. a silent shout against the coming storm. To Abraham's left, Joseph, a figure draped in a faded shawl and a tattered coat, looked utterly petrified. His hands were raised in a futile gesture of defense, as if to ward off an unseen assailant. The pallor of his skin and the beads of sweat tracing paths down his forehead spoke volumes of the terror gripping him. On the right, Sarah, her head covered by a simple cloth, appeared equally stricken, her hand hovering near her face as if to stifle a scream or shield herself from a horrifying sight. Behind them, our battered, covered wagon stood as a weary sentinel, a testament to journeys undertaken and hardships endured. Its wheels, heavy with the miles, seemed to groan under the weight of our meager belongings, our hopes and dreams packed into its shadowed interior. We were bound for a new settlement, a whisper of opportunity carried on the wind. The eastern towns had grown tight, their promises withered, forcing us to seek fortune in the untamed west, a path fraught with peril. For days, an unnerving silence had clung to us, the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes tracking our progress across the vast emptiness. That morning, faint movements had flickered against the distant peaks of the mountains. Abraham had stiffened instantly, his seasoned instincts screaming a warning. It was an omen, he knew, of ill tidings. A palpable tension had settled amongst us, a low hum of anxiety that now threatened to crescendo into a terrifying reality. Suddenly, a piercing cry ripped through the stillness, echoing from behind the western ridge. Simultaneously, the thunder of multiple horses' hooves began to pound the parched earth, the sound growing rapidly closer, a drumbeat of impending doom. "They're coming!" Abraham roared, his voice raw with urgency. Joseph whimpered, collapsing onto the dusty ground, his resolve shattering. Sarah gasped, her fingers digging into my arm, her grip like a vice. My own heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. We were alone in this unforgiving land, miles from any semblance of civilization. Our only defenses were a dwindling supply of provisions and this rickety wagon. Abraham swiftly seized the reins of the horses, positioning himself protectively beside the wagon. "Get behind the wagon." His voice was firm, a shield against the encroaching fear, but the tremor in his eyes did not escape my notice. Within moments, a band of armed figures crested the ridge, their faces obscured by dark cloths, glints of steel flashing in their hands, swords and rifles held with menacing intent. Their horses were lean and swift, their riders exuding a cold, predatory air. Abraham raised his two revolvers, the black muzzles unwavering. His calloused finger tightened on the triggers. It was a desperate confrontation, the odds stacked heavily against us. Yet, in the grim set of Abraham's jaw, I saw a flicker of defiance, a promise to fight until his last breath. As Sarah scrambled for cover behind the wagon, her voice a mere breath, she whispered, "May God have mercy on us." I too crouched behind the relative safety of the wagon, the pounding of hooves growing deafening, punctuated only by Abraham's low growl of readiness. The ashen clouds continued their relentless march across the sky, casting the rugged landscape in a deepening gloom, as if nature itself was mirroring the grim fate that awaited us in this desolate corner of the world. Here, on this unforgiving frontier, a brutal test of survival, a dance between life and death, was about to begin.
The Silent Garden. Long ago, in a land where the sky was always the color of lavender just before dusk, there was a kingdom that no longer spoke. No voices rose in laughter or song, no arguments broke out in markets, no children cried, and no lullabies were sung to sleepy infants. The people of the kingdom had forgotten the use of speech entirely. They lived by gesture, by glance, by silence. And though they did not suffer, they also did not dream. In the heart of this hushed realm stood a great wall of ivy-covered stone. It surrounded a place called the Silent Garden, though no one remembered why it was named so. The gates to the garden were sealed by vines so thick no tool could cut them. Over time, The people stopped wondering what lay beyond. The silence made them forget to be curious. But there was one girl in the kingdom who had not forgotten everything. Her name was Mira. Mira had been born on the last night anyone spoke. Her mother, they said, had sung a lullaby that night so sweet and sorrowful it echoed through the hills. And then, like a candle snuffed by wind, the voices of the world vanished. Mira never heard her mother speak again, but sometimes she would watch her lips move silently in the dark, shaping words no one could remember how to hear. Mira was different. While others accepted the quiet, she collected forgotten sounds in her dreams. At night, she would hear whispers like the rustle of feathers or distant strings of music floating through fields. She could not name these things, but she felt them stir deep inside her. And one morning, when the fog clung low to the ground and the birds circled silently above, Mira heard something real. It was not a dream, not a wind, not a memory. It was a voice, barely more than a breath, but it said her name. Mira. She stood very still, barefoot on the dewy grass, eyes wide. The voice spoke again, softer this time, almost shy. Come. She turned toward the sound. It came from the direction of the garden. For the rest of the day, Mira could not focus. The silent town moved around her as usual, fishermen casting nets without calling out, bakers handing bread across counters with tired eyes, children playing games without sound. But Myra's heart beat too loudly in her chest to join them. The voice had awakened something. That night, she returned to the place where the garden wall rose like a sleeping giant wrapped in vines. The voice did not return, but the silence here was different. It was not empty. It was waiting. She placed her hand on the ivy. The leaves shifted under her palm. The vines trembled, then unwound themselves slowly, revealing a sliver of stone archway. Mira stepped back. She had not expected this. With cautious hands, she pulled the vines away. They slid off the stone like threads from a worn coat. The gate, once sealed, now stood open just enough for a single person to pass. She stepped through. The silent garden was not what she imagined. It was larger than it seemed from outside, and filled with trees that shimmered faintly, as if holding moonlight in their leaves. There were flowers that seemed to glow without light, and paths that wove through the landscape like soft melodies. There was no noise, and yet the garden pulsed with something deeper than sound. Mira walked slowly, afraid that even her breath might disturb the stillness. And then she heard it again. Mira. The voice was clearer now, though still gentle, like a thought spoken between dream and waking. "Who are you?" she asked quietly, though she did not expect an answer. "I am the echo of your world's voice," it said. "I live here, where silence begins and ends." "Why did the world stop speaking?" she asked. "Because the world forgot how to listen." Mira stood for a long time, her hand brushing the petals of a blue flower that hummed softly at her touch. She sat by a pool where the water mirrored the sky perfectly, though no stars yet hung in the heavens. She walked until she came to a tree taller than all others, its trunk wide as a cottage, its roots deep as memory. "This," said the voice, "is the tree of saying." Long ago, every word spoken by every creature passed through its branches. It was neither judge nor keeper, but listener. "What happened?" Mira asked. "When the people spoke without care, when they used words like stones and forgot their weight, the tree closed its ears. The world followed." "Can it be opened again?" she asked. "Perhaps," the voice said, "if someone remembers how to speak not with noise, but with truth." Mira sat beneath the tree. She closed her eyes and thought of everything she had never said. She thought of the way her mother smiled, the way the sea used to sing, the way stories once floated around the fire. She thought of her longing for names, for songs, for the warmth of voices in the air. And then, very softly, she began to hum. It was barely a sound, a low and broken thread of melody. But it was real. It trembled from her throat and into the air, and the garden listened. The leaves rustled gently. She sang the memory of her mother's lullaby, the one she had never heard, but always felt. She sang her own name, and the names of birds she had read in old books. She sang the feeling of morning and the ache of quiet. And as she sang, the garden began to bloom. The flowers opened wider. The trees leaned in. The stars appeared one by one above her head. When she finished, the voice returned, closer now. You have remembered. The world will begin again. Mira opened her eyes. The garden glowed. She stepped through the gate, which now hung wide open. As she passed through her town, lights flickered in windows. People stirred in their sleep. Some sat up, holding their breath, as though they had heard something in their dreams. A few wept without knowing why. The next morning, as the sun rose golden and slow, a child in the village spoke a word. "Mama." And the silence began to break. The people looked to one another in wonder. Words returned slowly, like seeds that had waited in dry ground for rain. Laughter returned. Music was remembered. And above all, they listened.
The Titan's gift and the Sky Father's decree. In the dawn of time, when the world was fresh and gods walked among mortals, there lived a mighty Titan named Prometheus. Unlike his brethren who often reveled in their power, Prometheus possessed a heart brimming with empathy and a profound love for the nascent human race. He watched them shiver in the biting winds, huddle in dark caves, and eat their food raw, and a deep sorrow settled in his generous spirit. Their lives were harsh, short, and filled with a constant struggle against the elements. Above them, on the shimmering peak of Mount Olympus, resided the Olympian gods, led by the formidable Zeus, the Sky Father. They held sway over all the elements, and among their most cherished and jealously guarded possessions was fire. It was a divine essence, a living warmth that brought light, comfort, and the power to transform. Zeus believed that humanity was not yet ready for such a potent gift, fearing they would abuse it or challenge the god's supremacy. Prometheus, however, could not bear to see humanity suffer. He knew that fire was the key to their advancement, the spark that would ignite their ingenuity and allow them to truly flourish. With a plan brewing in his wise mind, he decided to defy Zeus's decree. One day, stealthily, he descended from the heights of Olympus. He did not snatch the fire with force, but rather with a clever and gentle trick. He found a hollow fennel stalk, a common plant, and approached the hearth of the gods. With immense care, he captured a tiny, glowing ember within the stalk, so small it was barely noticeable, yet potent with divine energy. Hashtag, a new dawn for humanity. He brought this precious spark down to earth, not as a destructive blaze, but as a tender flame. He taught the shivering humans how to coax the ember into a crackling fire, how to feed it with dry wood, and how to protect it from the wind and rain. He showed them how to cook their food, making it more palatable and nourishing. He demonstrated how the warmth could keep them safe from the chilling nights, and how the light could dispel the fear of the unknown darkness. With fire, a revolution began among humanity. They learned to forge tools, build stronger shelters, and even create art. Their faces, once etched with worry, now glowed with newfound hope and wonder. Laughter echoed through their settlements, and stories were told around the flickering flames. Prometheus watched with a quiet joy, seeing his beloved humans begin their ascent towards civilization. He had given them not just fire, but the potential for progress and a true sense of community. Hashtag the Sky Father's justice and the eagle's shadow. But nothing on Olympus remained a secret from Zeus for long. The smoke from human hearths, the warmth emanating from their villages, and their newfound confidence reached his all-seeing eyes. Zeus, in his wrath, felt a profound sense of betrayal. How dared a Titan defy his will and bestow such power upon mere mortals? His thunder roared across the heavens, signaling his fury. He could not simply reclaim the fire. It had taken root in the human world. So, Zeus decreed a severe, yet symbolic, punishment for Prometheus. He ordered Hephaestus, the divine smith, to forge unbreakable chains. Prometheus was then led to the desolate, craggy peaks of the Caucasus Mountains. There, under the watchful gaze of the other gods, he was bound to a colossal rock, his arms outstretched, his body exposed to the elements. Zeus's punishment was not meant to be one of constant, agonizing torture, but rather a perpetual reminder of Prometheus's transgression and the unyielding power of the Olympian order. Every day, a majestic eagle, a symbol of Zeus himself, would fly to the mountain. It was not a vicious attack, but rather a methodical, symbolic act. The eagle, with its sharp talons, would perch near Prometheus, its piercing gaze fixed upon him. Then, in a solemn and almost ritualistic manner, it would gently, but persistently, nudge and pluck at his chest, never truly harming him in a fatal way, but ensuring a continual, mild discomfort and a stark reminder of his defiance. Prometheus endured his fate with silent fortitude. He looked out at the vast world below, a world now lit by the very fire he had brought. He felt the gentle yet unwavering presence of the eagle, a constant symbol of his bond to the god's will. Yet, despite his confinement and the daily visitation, his spirit remained unbroken. He knew the warmth he had brought to humanity would endure, a beacon of hope that transcended his own suffering. His sacrifice, though physically limiting, had forged a path for human flourishing, and in that knowledge, Prometheus found a profound, if quiet, peace. His was a story of ultimate sacrifice, not for personal glory, but for the betterment of all humanity. Elias, with his bushy white beard and eyes that sparkled with a lifetime of recounted adventures, initially scoffed. How could one make history, brimming with passion and conflict, anything less than thrilling? Still, the villagers pleaded, their faces etched with the fatigue of long days toiling in the fields and workshops. With a sigh, Elias agreed to try. His first attempt was the siege of Ethelgard, a legendary conflict from the early medieval period. Elias began with his usual flair, describing the thunderous charge of cavalry, the clash of steel on shield, and the agonizing cries from the battlements as siege engines hurled massive stones. He painted vivid pictures of brave knights leading desperate sallies and cunning strategists outwitting their foes. But as he looked at his audience, he saw not drowsy faces, but wide, eager eyes, leaning forward in anticipation. A young boy in the front row was practically vibrating with excitement. More Elias. What happened next? Did the castle fall? Elias slumped. His vibrant narrative had achieved the opposite of its intended effect. The following night, he pivoted to mythology, choosing the tale of Heracles battling the Nemean lion. He described the demigod's immense strength, the lion's terrifying roar, and the brutal, no-holds-barred struggle between man and beast. He detailed every sinew, every muscle strained, every desperate maneuver. Surely, this raw, primal combat would be too intense for sleep. Yet, the villagers were enthralled, their collective gasp echoing in the still night air when Heracles finally subdued the monstrous creature. "Magnificent," someone whispered, awestruck. Elias simply shook his head. His historical zeal was proving an insurmountable obstacle to slumber. Hashtag the art of the mundane. Elias retreated to his cottage, pondering his dilemma. The problem wasn't his storytelling. It was that his stories were too good. He needed to drain the lifeblood from them, to extract the essence of boredom. He began poring over dusty scrolls and forgotten chronicles, searching not for the momentous events, but for the interstitial details, the long periods of inactivity, the bureaucratic minutiae. 3 figures stood within the rough-hewn walls of a Viking longhouse, the air thick with a mingled sense of wood smoke and stale ale. Lager, her long, wavy blonde hair catching the dim light filtering through a high window, stood with her arms crossed like twin shields guarding a precious treasure, her patience. Her blue tunic, embroidered with intricate knotwork, seemed to darken with her mood. On her right, Bjorn Ironhide leaned against a post, his long brown hair and beard a familiar sight in the flickering firelight. A smirk played on his lips as he watched his sister. He found a peculiar amusement in her current state, though he knew better than to voice it too loudly. He'd learned over the years that Lajertha's displeasure was a storm best weathered in silence. To Lajertha's left, and slightly closer, stood Ivar the Boneless. Though his legs were weak, his spirit was anything but. A wide, mischievous grin stretched across his face, his red beard bristling with barely suppressed laughter. He pointed a thick finger towards something just out of Lajertha's sight, his eyes dancing with shared amusement with Bjorn. The source of Lajertha's irritation lay just beyond Ivar, a half-empty wooden tankard of strong ale and a well-worn battle axe leaning against the wall. The axe was hers, a trusty companion in countless raids. The ale, well, the ale was the heart of the matter. Earlier that evening, after a successful foray down the fjord, Lagertha had declared the spoils would be divided fairly. Her share included a generous portion of the finest ale. However, upon returning to the longhouse, she discovered her tankard significantly lighter than it should have been. Bjorn, ever the opportunist, had helped himself to a small taste, as he'd put it with a disarming grin. Ivar, never one to be left out, had then contributed to the dwindling supply, citing the need to test its quality. Lagertha had arrived to find them both looking rather pleased with themselves and her ale rapidly disappearing. Hence, the crossed arms, the thunderous expression, and Ivar's pointed finger towards the nearly depleted tankard, a silent, shared joke at her expense. Bjorn's smirk widened almost imperceptibly. He knew Lagertha wouldn't stay angry for long, especially not when there was more ale to be had, preferably a share this time. Ivar continued to chuckle, thoroughly enjoying the drama. Despite her annoyance, a flicker of a smile threatened to break through Lajertha's stern facade. These two were infuriating, yes, but they were her brothers. And in the rough and tumble world of Vikings, a little shared mischief, even at one's own expense, was just another thread in the strong tapestry of family. She might even join their jest soon enough, perhaps after ensuring their own ale supplies suffered a similar, unexpected shrinkage. The night was young, and in the longhouse, the laughter and the clinking of tankards were sure to continue. One crisp European evening, as twilight painted the village of Oakhaven in hues of lavender and gray, an old storyteller named Elias found himself in an unusual predicament. For generations, his family had been revered for their vibrant tales of heroes, monsters, and grand historical epics, recited with a fervor that would ignite the very souls of their listeners. Yet, the modern age had brought with it a peculiar demand from the weary villagers. Stories, yes, but stories so unbearably mundane that they would gently coax sleep from the most stubborn insomniac. Elias, with his bushy white beard and eyes that sparkled with a lifetime of recounted adventures, initially scoffed. How could one make history, brimming with passion and conflict, anything less than thrilling? Still, the villagers pleaded, their faces etched with the fatigue of long days toiling in the fields and workshops. With a sigh, Elias agreed to try. His first attempt was the siege of Ethelgard, a legendary conflict from the early medieval period. Elias began with his usual flair, describing the thunderous charge of cavalry, the clash of steel on shield, and the agonizing cries from the battlements as siege engines hurled massive stones. He painted vivid pictures of brave knights leading desperate sallies and cunning strategists outwitting their foes. But as he looked at his audience, he saw not drowsy faces, but wide, eager eyes, leaning forward in anticipation. A young boy in the front row was practically vibrating with excitement. More Elias. What happened next? Did the castle fall? Elias slumped. His vibrant narrative had achieved the opposite of its intended effect. The following night, he pivoted to mythology. choosing the tale of Heracles battling the Nemean lion. He described the demigod's immense strength, the lion's terrifying roar, and the brutal, no-holds-barred struggle between man and beast. He detailed every sinew, every muscle strained, every desperate maneuver. Surely this raw, primal combat would be too intense for sleep. Yet, the villagers were enthralled, their collective gasp echoing in the still night air when Heracles finally subdued the monstrous creature. "Magnificent," someone whispered, awestruck. Elias simply shook his head. His historical zeal was proving an insurmountable obstacle to slumber. Hashtag the art of the mundane. Elias retreated to his cottage, pondering his dilemma. The problem wasn't his storytelling. It was that his stories were too good. He needed to drain the lifeblood from them, to extract the essence of boredom. He began poring over dusty scrolls and forgotten chronicles, searching not for the momentous events, but for the interstitial details, the long periods of inactivity, the bureaucratic minutiae. His next performance began with the construction of the Roman road from Lutetia to Massilia. Instead of focusing on the engineer's genius or the strategic importance, Elias began by describing the precise dimensions of the aggregates used in the roadbed. He detailed the number of layers of compacted earth and gravel, the exact gradient calculations for drainage, and the sheer monotony of laborers endlessly breaking stones and moving earth. He spoke of the slow, unchanging pace of the work, day after tedious day, under a sun that merely warmed rather than inspired. There were no dramatic battles, no heroic feats, just the endless, repetitive rhythm of manual labor across vast distances. A subtle shift occurred. A few heads began to nod. He then moved to the daily life of a medieval monastic scribe. He described the precise way the quills were sharpened, the formula for mixing ink from gall nuts and soot, and the hours upon tedious hours spent meticulously copying Latin texts by candlelight. He spoke of the aching backs, the cramped fingers, and the utter lack of conversation as silent figures bent over illuminated manuscripts, meticulously correcting the tiniest errors. He lingered on the monotonous diet of gruel and bread, and the predictable chime of the bells marking canonical hours. By the time Elias finished describing the scribe's methodical placement of a single capital letter, a soft wave of snores was already rippling through the audience. A smile touched Elias's lips. He had found his calling. Hashtag the lullaby of history. From that night forward, Elias became the chronicler of somnolent history. His performances were highly anticipated, not for excitement, but for the promise of profound rest. He would describe the intricate tax codes of the Byzantine Empire, explaining in painstaking detail the varying rates on agricultural produce and the lengthy process of appeals. He would narrate the slow, bureaucratic process of commissioning a new ship in the Venetian arsenal, focusing on the procurement of timber, the hiring of specialized craftsmen, and the endless meetings about budget allocations, rather than its glorious maiden voyage. His masterpiece, perhaps, was the account of the great European famine of the 14th century, told not through tales of starvation and suffering, but through the unending, heavy rainfall that ruined crops year after year. He described the soggy fields, the constant dampness, and the dull, gray sameness of the sky that persisted for months, emphasizing the crushing predictability of the ecological disaster. There was no villain, no heroic struggle against adversity, just the relentless, spirit-crushing boredom of endless rain. The villagers of Oakhaven would gather, bringing blankets and pillows, settling in for an evening of peaceful repose. Elias's voice, once booming with valor, became a gentle, rhythmic drone, weaving tales of the tedious, the ordinary, and the incredibly unexciting. He proved that even the most dramatic of human stories, when stripped of their passion and retold with a focus on their most mundane elements, could become the most potent lullabies. And so, in a quiet corner of Europe, the legend of Elias, the storyteller who could bore people to sleep with history, lived on. The biting wind howled through the skeletal branches of the barren trees, carrying with it a relentless flurry of snow. The landscape was a monochrome canvas of white and gray, a stark backdrop to the silent tragedy unfolding at the edge of the isolated village. Here, tethered to the weathered timbers of an ancient stock, stood two figures, their forms hunched against the brutal elements. The elder of the two was a man etched with the harsh lines of hardship. His face, a roadmap of wrinkles, was contorted in a silent scream, his chapped lips parted as if the last vestiges of a desperate cry had frozen in the frigid air. His eyes, though clouded with pain, still held a flicker of a fierce, protective love as he glanced towards his companion. Beside him, the younger woman shivered uncontrollably. Her thin shawl offered little solace against the penetrating cold. Her face, though youthful, bore the marks of recent suffering, gaunt cheeks, sunken eyes that mirrored the bleak winter sky. Tears, or perhaps melted snowflakes, had traced icy paths down her skin, freezing into delicate patterns. Her hands, raw and red, clutched at her chest, as if trying to contain the agonizing chill that gripped her from within. A crude wooden bucket lay overturned in the snow nearby, a testament to the villagers' minimal effort to provide sustenance before their abandonment. A rusty, three-pronged pitchfork stood half-buried in the drift, a stark reminder of the agricultural life that seemed a world away from this scene of desolation. Their plight had begun weeks prior, with the arrival of a creeping sickness that painted their skin with angry red blotches. Fear, the most contagious disease in the close-knit community, had spread like wildfire. Whispers of a divine curse, a malevolent plague brought by outsiders, filled the air. The village elder, a man whose wisdom was often overshadowed by superstition, declared them tainted, a danger to the collective. Despite their pleas, their desperate cries of innocence, they were dragged to the village outskirts and locked in the stock. The villagers, their faces a mixture of fear and grim satisfaction, retreated to the warmth of their hearths, leaving the afflicted to the mercy of the unforgiving winter. Days blurred into nights, marked only by the ceaseless fall of snow and the gnawing hunger that became a constant companion. The elder man, despite his own weakening state, tried to shield the woman from the worst of the wind, his frail body a meager barrier against the onslaught. He would whisper stories of warmer times, of sun-drenched fields and bountiful harvests, his voice a fragile thread in the howling wind, trying to keep hope alive in the face of overwhelming despair. The younger woman, who he called Alara, would listen with what little strength she had left, her imagination painting vivid pictures of the life she might never know. She dreamt of spring flowers pushing through the thawing earth, of birdsong filling the air, of the comforting warmth of a loving embrace. But the reality was a brutal assault on their senses. The cold seeped into their bones, stealing their warmth, their strength, their will to resist. The hunger gnawed relentlessly, turning their stomachs into tight knots of pain. The snow piled higher, a silent shroud slowly enveloping them. One morning, Alara's breathing grew shallow, her eyes losing their focus. The elder man, his heart breaking, cradled her head in his lap, his weathered hands stroking her frozen hair. He hummed a lullaby, a melody from their distant past, his voice thick with unshed tears. As the last vestiges of life flickered from Alara's eyes, a profound sense of despair washed over the old man. His protective instinct, his reason for holding on, had vanished. He closed his eyes, the cold seeping deeper into his own weary soul. The snow continued to fall, a soft, silent blanket covering the two figures bound to the stock. The village remained oblivious, their fear having blinded them to the human tragedy that had unfolded at their doorstep. The wind whispered through the empty landscape, carrying no cries, no stories, only the mournful song of winter, a testament to the cruelty born of fear and the devastating consequences of abandonment. The stock, the bucket, the pitchfork, these silent witnesses stood as a stark reminder of the human cost of prejudice in the face of the unknown, a chilling tale etched in the frozen heart of the desolate winter. The Weaver of Dhaka. The year is 1700. The Mughal Empire holds sway over the vast Indian subcontinent, and the city of Dhaka is a jewel in its crown, renowned throughout the world for its exquisite muslin. Among the countless artisans who call this bustling city home is a young woman named Aisha. Her fingers, nimble and swift, dance across the loom, weaving threads so fine they seem like spun moonlight. Aisha belongs to a lineage of master weavers, their creations gracing the bodies of emperors and European royalty alike. But the times are changing. The distant shores of England are stirring with new technologies and whispers of powerful looms that can mimic and perhaps even surpass the delicate artistry of Dhaka's weavers have begun to reach the city. Aisha's father, Ustad Ibrahim, a respected figure in the weaving community, views these rumors with apprehension. He clings to the traditions passed down through generations, believing that no machine can ever truly capture the soul woven into their muslin. But Aisha, ever curious and with a keen eye for the changing world, sees a different path. One day, a foreign merchant, a shrewd Englishman named Thomas Ashton, arrives in Dhaka. He is captivated by the sheer beauty of Aisha's work, a piece so ethereal it feels like holding a cloud in one's hands. Ashton, however, is not just an admirer. He is a representative of the burgeoning textile industry in England, tasked with understanding the secrets behind Dhaka's famed muslin. He seeks out Ustad Ibrahim, offering generous sums for insights into their techniques. The Ustad, wary of the foreigner's intentions, politely refuses. But Ashton is persistent. He observes Aisha as she works, noticing her innovative adaptations to the traditional loom, her intuitive understanding of the thread's delicate properties. Recognizing her talent and her open-mindedness, Ashton approaches Aisha directly. He speaks of the advancements in his homeland, not with arrogance, but with a sense of shared fascination for the craft. He shows her sketches of early mechanical looms, explaining their basic principles. Aisha is intrigued. She sees the potential for collaboration, a way to blend the timeless artistry of Dhaka with the efficiency of new technologies. But her ideas are met with resistance from the traditionalists, including her own father, who see this as a betrayal of their heritage. Torn between loyalty to her family and the pull of innovation, Aisha embarks on a secret journey of learning. Under the guise of visiting a distant relative, she travels to the coastal regions where some European traders have established small workshops. There, she observes rudimentary mechanical processes, carefully noting how they might be adapted to the delicate art of muslin weaving. Returning to Dhaka, Aisha faces the challenge of integrating her newfound knowledge without causing further division. She begins to experiment in secret, modifying her own loom with subtle mechanisms inspired by her observations. Slowly, she discovers ways to increase efficiency without sacrificing the quality that makes Dhaka's muslin unique. News of Aisha's innovations begins to spread, initially with suspicion, then with growing curiosity. Some weavers fear that her methods will lead to mass production and the devaluation of their skills. Others, seeing the changing tides of the global market, recognize the need to adapt. The conflict comes to a head during the annual textile fair in Dhaka. Aisha unveils a new creation, a muslin sari woven with a subtle blend of traditional techniques and her own adaptations. The fabric is as exquisite as ever, but its creation was demonstrably more efficient. The reaction is mixed. Ustad Ibrahim is initially disheartened, seeing it as a step towards the very mechanization he feared. But as he examines the sari closely, he recognizes the enduring artistry in Aisha's work, the way she has integrated the new without losing the essence of their craft. Thomas Ashton, present at the fair, is impressed not just by the quality of the fabric, but by Aisha's ingenuity. He realizes that the true strength of Dhaka's weaving lies not just in its ancient techniques, but in the adaptability and skill of its artisans. In the years that follow, Dhaka's weaving community grapples with the changing world. Aisha becomes a bridge between tradition and innovation, teaching her methods while fiercely advocating for the preservation of their unique artistic heritage. The whispers of English looms grow louder, and the Industrial Revolution begins its inexorable march. But in Dhaka, thanks to the vision of a young weaver, the delicate dance between tradition and progress continues, ensuring that the legacy of their exquisite muslin endures, even in a rapidly changing world. The case of the missing mangoes. The midday sun beat down on the sleepy village of Amtalai, its rays shimmering off the placid surface of the pond. Usually, the air would be filled with the cheerful banter of children and the rhythmic thud of mangoes falling on a soft earth. But today, a palpable tension hung in the air, thick and heavy like the pre-monsoon humidity. The matter at hand, the great mango heist. Old man Rahim, the proud owner of the largest and juiciest mango orchard in Amtalai, had discovered it that morning. A significant portion of his prized Alfonso mangoes, the ones destined for the capital's high-end markets, had vanished overnight. No forced entry, no footprints, just empty branches where plump, golden fruit had hung only hours before. Panic had rippled through the village, not just for Rahim's loss, but for the unsettling nature of the crime. It was as if the mangoes had simply evaporated into thin air. Enter Detective Inspector Kamal Hossein, a man known for his sharp intellect and even sharper mustache. He arrived in Amtalai in a dusty jeep, his gaze immediately taking in the scene. Rahim, a picture of distress, wrung his hands, recounting the events of the previous night. "I swear, Inspector," Rahim rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "I locked the gates myself. The dogs didn't bark. Nothing. It's as if ghosts came and plucked them clean." Kamal surveyed the orchard. The mango trees stood laden with the remaining fruit, their leaves rustling gently in the breeze. He noted the lack of any discernible tracks on the soft soil around the trees. He questioned the night watchman, a young lad named Farouk, who swore he had seen and heard nothing unusual. Days turned into a week, and the mystery deepened. Kamal interviewed every villager, from the baker to the boatman, but no one could offer a plausible explanation. Some whispered about supernatural forces, others suspected rival orchard owners, but no concrete evidence emerged. Kamal found himself drawn to the seemingly insignificant details. He revisited the orchard multiple times, meticulously examining the ground, the trees, even the discarded mango leaves. He learned everything about Rahim's routines, his relationships with other villagers, and the usual patterns of life in Amtalai. One sweltering afternoon, as he sat under the shade of a banyan tree near the pond, observing children playing, something clicked. He watched as one boy cleverly used a long, hooked stick to pull down a guava from a high branch. An idea began to form in Kamal's mind. He returned to Rahim's orchard, and this time, he focused his attention upwards, high up in the canopy of the largest mango tree. Almost hidden by the dense foliage, he spotted faint but distinct scratch marks on a thick branch. He called for a ladder and carefully climbed up. There, partially concealed by leaves, he found what he was looking for, a long, sturdy bamboo pole with a hook fashioned at its end, and fragments of mango skin clinging to the hook. The method was ingenious, albeit laborious. The thief, or thieves, had likely used these hook poles to pluck the mangoes from the higher branches during the dead of night, carefully avoiding the lower ones to make it seem like fewer were missing initially. The lack of ground tracks was explained by the fact that they didn't need to get directly under most of the trees. But who were the culprits? Kamal gathered the villagers again. He explained his deduction about the hook poles. A hush fell over the crowd. Then, his gaze settled on a group of young men who had been unusually quiet throughout the investigation. They were known for their agility and their tendency to engage in mischievous pranks. Under Kamal's persistent questioning, one of them finally broke down. It turned out that a group of 5 young men, driven by boredom and a desire for some quick money, had hatched the plan. They had observed Rahim's routine, knew the orchard layout, and under the cover of darkness, had systematically plucked the ripest mangoes using the hook poles. They had then transported the loot in small batches along the narrow village paths, avoiding the main road, and sold them in a neighboring market. The recovered mangoes were a bit bruised, but still valuable. Rahim was overjoyed, not just at the recovery of his fruit, but at the unraveling of the mystery that had gripped his village. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across Amtalai, Detective Inspector Kamal Hossein sat sipping tea, the tension in the air finally replaced by a sense of relief and renewed peace.